March 23, 1945, 10:47 in the morning. Winston Churchill's aircraft descended toward Germany, carrying him to witness what should have been Britain's finest hour. Field Marshal Montgomery had prepared Operation Plunder for months, the massive Rhine crossing that would prove British forces still led the Allied war effort. Churchill had personally promised Montgomery this moment of glory. The radio crackled to life. 4 words shattered everything. Patton crossed last night. Not today, with Montgomery's carefully orchestrated assault. Not with 1,000 artillery pieces and airborne divisions waiting below. Last night, George Patton had crossed the Rhine with boats and what he would later describe as a group of determined soldiers, stealing the glory Montgomery had been promised. Montgomery's message arrived within minutes, transmitted with barely controlled fury. 2 sentences that demanded an immediate answer. American insubordination has made a mockery of Allied planning. Patton must be relieved of command immediately. Churchill stared at the radio transcript, understanding instantly that the next words he spoke would define the future of the Anglo-American alliance, and perhaps the war itself. To understand the crisis facing Churchill, you must understand what Montgomery had been guaranteed. On January 12, 1945, Churchill had personally assured his field marshal that Operation Plunder would be the centerpiece of Allied victory. Not American improvisation, British professionalism. Montgomery had spent 2 full months organizing the assault. He commanded 1.2 million men, coordinated 25,000 vehicles, positioned 3,500 artillery pieces, and planned intricate airborne drops and smoke screens. This would be the largest river crossing since Normandy, executed with the precision that defined British military excellence. Churchill had made special arrangements. War correspondents had been invited, photographers positioned. Churchill himself had drafted the communiqué celebrating British military superiority that would be released the instant Montgomery's forces secured the eastern bank. Everything was prepared. Everything except George Patton apparently had different plans. March 22, 10:37 at night. Patton telephoned Eisenhower from Luxembourg, with an update delivered in his characteristically casual tone. Ike, quick note. We crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. Used assault boats. Minimal casualties. Thought you'd want to know. Eisenhower's response, captured in staff telephone logs, revealed his immediate grasp of the political disaster. George, please tell me you coordinated this with Montgomery. Patton's reply was pure Patton. Monty's got his own crossing tomorrow. Didn't want to bother him with details. Eisenhower hung up and immediately summoned his chief of staff. Get me Churchill. George just created the biggest diplomatic crisis of the war. The Americans understood what Patton had done. He hadn't just crossed a river. He had crossed a political line that could fracture the alliance at the moment of victory. Eisenhower spent the next several hours trying to formulate an explanation that wouldn't sound like what it was. An American general deliberately upstaging his British counterpart. March 23, 6:14 in the morning. Montgomery received confirmation that American forces had crossed the Rhine 12 hours before Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin. Multiple staff officers recorded his reaction. He didn't shout. He went cold. Patton has deliberately sabotaged Allied strategy to satisfy his ego. This is insubordination at the strategic level. I want him relieved, court-martialed, and sent home today. His chief of staff attempted to moderate the response. Sir, the crossing was successful. Third Army is expanding the bridgehead. Montgomery cut him off immediately. Success is irrelevant. Discipline is paramount. If Patton is allowed to ignore command authority, we have chaos, not coalition. He drafted an urgent message to Churchill. American general has conducted unauthorized operation violating agreed strategic framework. Request you demand Eisenhower relieve Patton immediately. British forces cannot operate alongside commanders who ignore command structure. Montgomery's staff watched him pace the command tent after sending the message. He believed absolutely in his position. Patton had violated every principle of coalition warfare. The command structure existed for a reason. Without it, armies became mobs pursuing individual glory rather than coordinated victory. But what Montgomery couldn't see, what his adherence to proper procedure prevented him from seeing, was that the war had changed. The methodical campaigns of 1942 and 1943 had given way to a race against time. The Soviets were advancing rapidly from the east. Every day of careful preparation was another day of Soviet territorial gains. Patton understood this reality. Montgomery did not. Churchill received Montgomery's message at 9:15 in the morning, minutes before his aircraft was scheduled to land in Germany. His military secretary watched as Churchill read the message 3 times before speaking. "May, what are the facts? Sir, Patton crossed at Oppenheim last night. Casualties under 30. Bridgehead secured. He did it without elaborate preparation, without Montgomery's permission, without anyone's permission." Churchill stared through the aircraft window at Germany below. Montgomery was his chosen general, his protégé, representing everything Churchill believed about proper military conduct. But Patton had just crossed Hitler's last natural barrier before Montgomery could even begin. The political mathematics were brutal. Support Montgomery, and Churchill would be demanding the firing of an American general for succeeding too quickly. Support Patton, and Churchill would be undermining British military prestige before the entire world. Churchill had seen this moment coming for months, though he'd refused to acknowledge it. The balance of power within the alliance had been shifting steadily since American production, American manpower, American logistics, all had gradually transformed the partnership from equals to senior and junior partners. But acknowledging that shift publicly, especially in a way that humiliated a British general, would be devastating for national morale. Yet denying reality carried its own costs. If Churchill demanded Patton's relief and Eisenhower complied, the Americans would resent it. If Eisenhower refused, British authority would be exposed as hollow. Either outcome would damage the alliance at the worst possible moment. Churchill's aircraft touched down at 10:52. Montgomery waited on the tarmac, posture rigid, face carefully controlled. Churchill descended the stairs as Montgomery saluted sharply. "Prime Minister, thank you for coming to witness Operation Plunder." Churchill's reply was carefully neutral. "Field Marshal, I received your message. Walk with me." They moved away from the assembled staff. Montgomery began immediately. "Prime Minister, I must insist Patton be relieved. His insubordination cannot stand." Churchill raised his hand. "Montgomery, I need you to answer one question with complete honesty. If Patton had asked permission to cross at Oppenheim last night, what would you have said?" Montgomery didn't hesitate. "I would have denied it. His crossing diverts attention from the main effort." "Your main effort?" "The Allied main effort, as agreed upon by planners." "Planners who gave you 2 months and gave Patton nothing." "Bernard, is this about strategy or pride?" Montgomery's face flushed. "Prime Minister, it's about maintaining command discipline." Churchill's response was quiet but devastating. "It's about Patton making you look slow." The words hung in the cold German air. Montgomery tried to respond, but Churchill continued. "Bernard, I've defended your methods for 3 years. Careful preparation, overwhelming force, minimal casualties. It's the British way, and it saved thousands of lives. But watching Patton cross the Rhine with boats while you needed 2 months to plan the same operation forces me to ask uncomfortable questions." Montgomery's voice was tight. "Prime Minister, if you're suggesting that American methods are superior, I'm suggesting that American speed achieves results we can no longer match." Churchill turned to face Montgomery directly. "The war is ending, Bernard. Germany is collapsing. Every day we spend in careful preparation is a day the Soviets advance further west. Patton understands this." Montgomery's reply was bitter. "So you're choosing him over me?" Churchill shook his head. "I'm choosing to win the war before the Soviets claim all of Europe. That requires speed we no longer possess." What Montgomery didn't know was that Churchill had been wrestling with this question for months. In December 1944, after Patton relieved Bastogne in 72 hours, Churchill had written in his private diary, "Patton does in days what takes us weeks." In January, watching Montgomery's deliberate advance while Patton raced across France, Churchill had confided to his physician, "The Americans have learned to move faster than we can think." Standing on the German airfield watching Montgomery's elaborate preparations, Churchill realized the truth he'd been avoiding. British military doctrine, the doctrine he'd defended throughout the war, had been surpassed by American operational speed. Montgomery made one last attempt. "Prime Minister, if Patton is not disciplined, you set a precedent that command authority means nothing." Churchill's response became the most honest assessment of Allied politics ever recorded. "Bernard, you're right. Patton should be disciplined. He violated protocol. He ignored coordination requirements. He made you and the British military establishment look foolish. But here's what you're not seeing. If I demand Eisenhower fire Patton, the Americans will ask why. And I'll have to explain that we're firing their most successful general because he succeeded too quickly without British permission. Do you understand how that sounds? Montgomery started to protest, but Churchill continued. The Americans are providing 70% of Allied forces. They're bearing the majority of casualties. They're funding this entire operation, and their general just demonstrated that he can cross the Rhine in one night, with minimal preparation, while we need 2 months and 1 million men to do the same thing. If I demand his firing, I'm admitting that British pride matters more than Allied victory. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of artillery. Operation Plunder had begun. Montgomery's crossing, meticulously planned, was finally happening. But everyone present knew it was no longer the main event. Churchill placed his hand on Montgomery's shoulder. "Bernard, you are one of Britain's finest commanders. History will remember your victories. But history will also remember that when the war's final chapter was written, an American general crossed the Rhine first, not because he was better than you, but because he was willing to risk everything on speed while we calculated caution." Montgomery's response was barely audible. "So I've lost." Churchill shook his head. "We've all lost something, Bernard. You've lost precedence. I've lost the illusion that British methods still define modern warfare. But we're winning the war. That has to be enough." Churchill returned to his aircraft without watching Montgomery's crossing. His military secretary recorded what happened next. The Prime Minister sat in complete silence for 20 minutes. Then he requested dictation. The message was addressed to General Eisenhower. "General, I have received Field Marshal Montgomery's request that General Patton be relieved for unauthorized Rhine crossing. After careful consideration, I must decline to support this request. General Patton's operation, while uncoordinated, was successful and contributes to Allied objectives. I recommend no action be taken." Churchill paused before signing. Then he added a handwritten postscript. "Ike, keep Patton moving. We can't afford to match his speed, but we can't afford to lose it either." That evening Churchill met privately with his personal physician, Lord Moran. Moran's diary provides the only record of what Churchill said when he thought no one important was listening. The Prime Minister looked exhausted. He poured himself a whiskey and spoke quietly. "I've just chosen American results over British pride. Montgomery will never forgive me. The military establishment will be furious. But watching Patton cross that river while we prepared our elaborate show made me realize something terrible. We're no longer the leading military power in this alliance. We haven't been for quite some time. I've just been too proud to admit it." Moran asked if Churchill regretted the decision. Churchill's response was immediate. "Not for a second. Pride doesn't win wars. Speed does. Patton understands that. Montgomery doesn't. And if I have to choose between a general who protects British prestige and a general who ends this war faster, I choose the one who brings our boys home." But Churchill continued, revealing the full weight of his thinking. "Here's what makes this moment so significant. Bernard demanded Patton be fired for insubordination. And he's right. Patton ignored command structure. He violated protocol. In any properly run military, he'd face sanctions. But here's what Bernard doesn't understand. We're not running a properly run military. We're running a coalition of competing national interests where the side with the most resources makes the rules. And that side is no longer Britain. It's America." Moran recorded Churchill's next words verbatim. "I spent this entire war pretending we were equal partners with the Americans. Today I admitted the truth. They're the senior partner now. They provide the majority of men, material and leadership. Patton crossed first because American military doctrine has surpassed ours, not in training, not in bravery, but in the willingness to move faster than caution recommends. That's the future of warfare, and we're no longer leading it." Churchill paused to refill his glass. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from exhaustion or emotion, Moran couldn't determine. The Prime Minister stared into the amber liquid before continuing. "The Empire spent centuries teaching the world how to wage war properly. We wrote the manuals on military professionalism. We established the standards for officer conduct. We created the systems that turned armies into instruments of national policy rather than armed mobs. And all of those centuries of accumulated wisdom has been rendered obsolete by American willingness to move faster than wisdom recommends. The consequences of Churchill's decision rippled through Allied command. Montgomery never forgave him. Their relationship, once warm, became coldly professional. British military leadership felt betrayed. The Chiefs of Staff sent a formal protest to Churchill, noting that failure to discipline Patton undermined all command authority. Churchill's response was blunt: "Would you prefer I demand his relief and watch the Americans ignore me? That would undermine British authority far more than this quiet acceptance." But Churchill's decision had strategic implications beyond hurt feelings. By refusing to support Montgomery's demand, Churchill signaled to American commanders that operational success would be rewarded even when it violated protocol. Patton understood this immediately. After learning Churchill had declined Montgomery's request, Patton wrote in his diary, "The British finally understand this is our war now. We'll finish it our way." The American press celebrated Patton's crossing as proof of American military superiority. British newspapers, restricted by wartime censorship, reported Operation Plunder as a major success, but couldn't avoid mentioning that American forces had crossed first. The British public, exhausted by 6 years of war, didn't particularly care who crossed first, as long as the war was ending, but the military establishment understood the symbolic importance of Churchill's decision. The final assessment came in Churchill's own memoirs, written years after the war. In Volume 6 of his history, he devoted an entire chapter to the Rhine crossings. He wrote, "General Patton's crossing at Oppenheim demonstrated that modern warfare rewards speed over preparation. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Plunder was a masterpiece of careful planning, but Patton's improvised assault achieved the same objective in one night with a fraction of the resources." The contrast was instructive and, for those of us who championed British methods, uncomfortable. But in a private letter to President Eisenhower in 1953, Churchill was more honest. "Ike, you asked me once if I regretted not supporting Montgomery's demand to fire Patton. The answer is no. Patton won the race to the Rhine. He helped end the war faster. He saved lives by moving so quickly the Germans couldn't organize coherent defense. Was he insubordinate? Absolutely. Was he necessary? More than I wanted to admit." What Churchill said when Montgomery demanded Patton be fired revealed the hardest lesson of coalition warfare. Sometimes you must choose between the general who makes you proud and the general who wins faster. Churchill chose speed. He chose results. He chose to admit that British military methods, however professional, had been surpassed by American operational tempo. And in making that choice, he acknowledged a truth that Britain had been avoiding since 1942. The empire that had once defined military excellence was no longer setting the standard. It was trying to keep pace. Montgomery wanted Patton punished for breaking the rules. Churchill understood that Patton had exposed an uncomfortable reality. In modern warfare, the side that moves fastest wins, and Britain could no longer move fast enough.